Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Jo Olson. I do communications here at Fresh Energy, and I'm here today to share with you a recording of the first webinar in our truly affordable 4-part webinar series taking place this July. In this discussion, Fresh Energy's Margaret Cherney-Hendrick and Precipitate's Elizabeth Turner dig into how all-electric affordable housing can really work. One note about the recording, I missed the first 10 seconds when I hit record, so you'll be joining mid-introduction with Michael Noble, Fresh Energy's Executive Director. And with that, I will begin the recording. Thanks for tuning in.
It can be entirely powered by a very, very small amount of renewable electricity. That would be housing that would be truly affordable over the long term. And I don't need to tell you how important this issue is, this climate issue, this housing issue, this equity issue. With this incredible economic downturn and the apparent inequities in our society, we all have a responsibility to build back and build back better than we had before. Right now, buildings account for nearly 40% of the total energy used across Minnesota. And every reasonable and well-informed person now agrees that we need to have a net carbon neutral economy by the middle of the century. So it makes no sense at all for us to be building new buildings with a carbon footprint, especially if we can economically and affordably build buildings without any carbon footprint at all. So let's work together to create super efficient, affordable housing that addresses the climate change, addresses equity, addresses a community economic development, and we have a terrific program of four conversations. Before we start today, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Stoll Reeves LLP, that's hosting this web series. I also want to thank all these incredible promotional partners who've helped to spread the word. I think we had nearly 325 people registered by this morning. And with that, I think I'll turn over the microphone to my colleague, the magnificent Margaret Cherney-Hendrick. She's the director of Fresh Energy's Beneficial Electrification Program. And I'm gonna turn off my microphone and turn off my camera. So with that, Margaret Cherney-Hendrick.
Thanks so much, Michael. And as Michael said, my name is Margaret Cherney-Hendrick. I direct Fresh Energy's Beneficial Electrification Program. And I am extremely excited to be joined today by Elizabeth Turner, founder and architect of Precipitate. Precipitate is known as a firm that responds to the pressing social, economic, and ecological justice issues of today through deep listening and engagement. As a passive house consultant, Elizabeth pioneered pre-certification of the Hook and Ladder development in Minneapolis, which is the first large multifamily project to FIAS Plus 2015 standards in Climate Zone 6A. This project is considered a testing zone for the industry and a model for super efficient structures. I'm especially excited that Elizabeth is kicking off this series because as a thought leader in the field, she's going to bring her real life experience to the conversation and dig into how all electric affordable housing can really work. She'll present for about 10 minutes, and then the final 15 minutes will turn to a question and answer period. Please use Zoom's Q&A feature to submit your questions as we go along, and there's an upvote function where you can upvote questions that you think are particularly relevant. Please don't use the chat function, so only the Q&A box. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. I've been really inspired by the work that Fresh Energy is doing to create equitable energy efficiency. And I'm going to speak about some of the projects that we're working on towards all electric housing. And there's quite a range from large affordable apartments, townhomes, and single family and a cluster development accessory dwelling unit in Minneapolis. And I also want to acknowledge that this doesn't happen alone. So we serve as a certified passive house consultant on a lot of these projects. And it doesn't happen without architects and engineers and contractors who are willing to dig in and learn something new and dig into the building science. It doesn't happen without developers who have a vision for the future that is beyond kind of the standard construction we're doing today. And it doesn't happen without public policy that incentivizes and supports these energy efficient buildings. So you'll find the names of some of the partners on the slides, and I'm also happy to answer more questions about who the partners were, and a lot of that is available on our website as well. So the projects that I'd like to talk about are Hook and Ladder in Minneapolis. That's the one that you've seen on all the advertising, 59 units certified to Passive House standards. That one is complete and constructed. Westside Flats 3B is in St. Paul. That's 82 units, breaking ground in the next couple of months, hopefully. And then we're also kicking off work with Bayview Affordable Housing in Madison, Wisconsin. And there's a range of projects. That's the drawing that you see to the bottom left, ranging from townhomes to a 48-unit apartment building and a community center. So all pursuing Passive House certification. We've been working on Monterey East co-housing to do some Passive House townhomes there, with the Community Action Center of Northfield on duplexes, and again with Bayview on some townhomes. And then in the single family realm, we're working on a couple of single family all electric off-grid cabin, as well as Uptown Straw House in Minneapolis, which is an ADU. And if you want to learn more about that project, I won't be talking about it today, or join a straw house build, you can visit uptownstrawhouse.weebly.com to learn more about it. Next slide. So we have all these crises going on right now. We have a climate crisis, we have a crisis of systemic racism, we have a crisis of affordable housing, and we have also now a crisis of public health. And it's really hard with all of these things going on to say, like, why should we be focusing on energy efficiency? It seems like there are so many bigger things that we should be tackling. And the reason that we at Precipitate have been focusing on it is because we really do think that focusing on energy efficiency impacts deeply all of these other crises we're dealing with. So this diagram is trying to get at that. When we focus on energy efficiency and affordable housing, we can really combat some equity and environmental justice issues. Future presenters will talk more about this, but there is a correlation between people who live in affordable housing, people who are renters and lower income and people of color, and energy efficiency in that affordable housing really impacts the comfort and health of the people who live there, as well as energy independence and water. Next. So what is Passive House? Really, we're focusing on reducing the energy consumption from space conditioning through an efficient envelope. And when we think about the most energy efficient envelope possible, we'd think of a styrofoam ball. That is what we'd want to be building. And obviously that's not realistic. We need to be breathing, we need to see out, we need spaces to live, and that's kind of the whole point of housing. So when we're thinking about energy efficiency, we're balancing what is, from a building science perspective, most energy efficient, and then what do we need in spaces. So think of a winter coat. It's warm, it's airtight, it's energy efficiency for your body, but you also have those openings to bring in joy and delight and make it usable. So in Passive House, we focus on 4 main things that I'll be telling some stories about. So windows, super insulation, thermal bridge free and airtight envelope. And that improves our envelope enough that we can focus on a reduced systems for heating and cooling the space, and energy recovery and continuous ventilation. Next. So there are a lot of benefits beyond energy, and I encourage you to read a really great white paper, The Non-Energy Benefits of Energy Efficiency and Weatherization Programs in Multifamily Housing, where a lot of these come from. And I just want to highlight a couple. So for benefits for the occupant, there's really has been proven to be increases in occupant comfort and wellness, and resilience in cases of extreme weather and power outages. For community, this is really a chance to put our ideas about equity into practice. And there's also been evidence of lower turnover and more resilience and care for vulnerable populations. And then for the owners themselves and developers and clients, focusing on energy efficiency opens up a lot more funding opportunities, and then also reduces maintenance and operation costs. Next. So we worked with the Community Action Center of Northfield on designs for affordable townhomes. And when we compared standard construction to Passive House compliant construction, we saw a 65% reduce in anticipated energy use of the buildings, going from energy use intensity of 54 kWts per square foot per year to 19. And you can see most of that happened in a reduction in space heating and then also a reduction in hot water. Next. So when we looked at the two different kinds of wall assemblies, the one on the left is kind of good standard construction. It has R21 fiberglass batt insulation, but when you take into account the heat that's lost because of the 2x4 wood studs, that drops to about R16. On the right, we have the Passive House wall, which has continuous exterior insulation, and that is more in the range of R36. And also considers airtightness. Next. We also thought about thermal bridging. So all of these places are where two pieces of the building come together and there's a high potential for heat loss. And we worked with the contractor and design team to minimize the heat loss to those locations. And next slide is one instance where in standard construction, we had a thermal loss where the bearing walls sit on a foundation below. And when we pulled this up on the screen and talked about it, the contractor realized that we could just continue that insulation all the way below, which resulted in not only a more efficient building, but more cost savings and easier construction. Next. All of this led to us being able to have a all-electric heating and cooling system. So we used an air-to-air heat pump with electric backup, continuous energy recovery ventilation. So if you're not familiar with that, it's when you're exhausting air from your conditioned spaces. So in the winter, that's warm, humid air that you have spent energy to heat, and you pass it by the cold, dry air that's coming in, and you can recover a substantial portion of that energy and not have to reheat or rehumidify that air. And then we also used an electric heat pump, hot water heater with drain water heat recovery. So that's just a really simple coil tube that is copper that goes on the drain line and recovers some of that heat. Next. So on the larger scale, how does Passive House energy use compare to existing housing stock? So this is a study that CSBR did in 2015. They looked at 65 apartment buildings, 51 properties with an average of 65 units. So really standard affordable housing stock in the state of Minnesota. Found the average energy use was 76.2 kWs per square foot per year. When we compare that to what was modeled for Hook and Ladder, now we're going to have actual performance data upcoming, but it was just built in 2019. That is projected to be closer to 22.4 kBGs per square foot per year. And you can see a lot of that is coming from a reduction in space heating. Next. So looking at Hook and Ladder, a couple of things to point out. This building not only is performing to a higher standard and substantially less energy use than typical, but it is right on a railroad track, which you can see in the background of that picture. And when we were doing site tours, it was kind of miserable with all the trains going by multiple times an hour. We'd have to stop our tours in order to talk, and going into the completed building, people are able to be in that space and barely hear the engine as it's rolling by right next to the building. So thinking of that from a user perspective too is really important. We're thinking about the quality of the spaces that we're putting it in. Also, often affordable housing happens in some like the leftover sites in cities. West Side Flats, this project that will be constructed soon, hopefully this year, it was designed before there was a desire to go to Passive House, so it was a little bit harder to get to those targets, and windows became a really important strategy. So we used a higher performing window than we were able to use on Hook and Ladder. And we also ended up getting rid of the mullions, the dividers between these windows. So we moved from 6 panes of glass to 1. And that was a strategy that helped us get just enough under the targets to be able to pass to Passive House standards. Next. The other piece when thinking about passive house design and high performance is that certification and verification are actually really critical for high performance buildings. Not only to make sure that they're built as they were designed, but to make sure that when you have really airtight and well sealed buildings, you're eliminating all of the issues with moisture and mold, and kind of making sure you have a high performance, low maintenance building into the future. Next. And a lot of questions about cost. How did this compare? So on hook and ladder, you can see that the Theist building and the standard building had a pretty comparable cost for the development per unit. And one of the reasons for that is that the standard building had underground parking, and the passive house building focused on passive house did not. So I think it is important to think about there's potentially a 10 to 15% increase in costs for a passive house over standard construction. However, the whole design process is about choices. So what choices are we making that prioritize the things that matter to tenants and to cities, and thinking about these crises that we're dealing with in particular. And the other thing that we found is in states that have incentivized a passive house for affordable housing and in their QAP process, the costs are really dropping rapidly. Because this is new, that the costs are higher. As it's more widely adopted in the marketplace, we anticipate that the costs can drop similar to other states that we've seen: Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Washington. Next. So this really comes back to this final slide, and I want to leave you with this before I take some questions. By focusing on energy efficiency in affordable housing, we are making an impact on the crises that we're dealing with as a society today, specifically with equity and environmental justice and affordable housing and the health and wellness of people who are living in affordable housing. So thank you for being here, and I can't wait to take your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. And before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone that the Truly Affordable webinar series is going to be returning next week with a conversation between my colleague, Janice Watts, Policy Associate with Fresh Energy's Energy Access and Equity Program, and St. Paul City Council member Mitra Jalali. And they'll be discussing the connection between energy and housing stability. So we hope you will be able to join us next week for that discussion. And also on behalf of everyone here at Fresh Energy, we really thank you for attending part 1 of our Truly Affordable webinar series. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website and our podcast, Decarbonize the Clean Energy Podcast. You can also learn more about Fresh Energy's work at our website. Here you can subscribe to our newsletter, check out the latest on our blog, and make a donation. Thank you so much for all of the work, Elizabeth, you did to prepare a great presentation, and I'm really excited to move into the Q&A. I see quite a few questions coming in now through the Q&A box, so keep those coming, please, and upvote if you like them, and I'll pull from these as well as some of the questions that were submitted during registration. So let's see. So the first that's rising to the top here, and this is from Matt, 10 to 15% cost increase in construction recovered in savings to tenants and society in how many years? And can those savings be worked into the finances overall?
Yeah, so I've seen other studies that have shown a pretty quick payback. We are still waiting on, like, we just built these projects, so we don't have payback numbers yet, but that's something that we're working on. For the Northfield affordable homes, we anticipate we'll get those numbers, but we finished our work on Wednesday, and the contractor is doing some pricing exercises. So we anticipate in the next couple of months, we'll have data on that, and you can check our website or reach out to me for updates.
Great. Let's see, this next question is from Ben. I often hear about financing barriers to affordable and efficient development. What advice do you have about approaching banks or other key players to finance a project that achieves these goals?
Mm-hmm. I think getting an appraiser who understands the value of energy efficiency is really critical. And not all, you looking at a kind of a square foot cost. So if you're comparing to a standard construction and not looking at the savings and energy efficiency, you won't be able to get financing to cover the cost of the project that you need. So having those upfront conversations with appraisers, having appraisers reach out to building science professionals that are on your team are really critical for making your projects financeable.
Great. And for this next question, we have another slide to queue up here. This is a question that was submitted anonymously during registration. Affordable housing funding providers have a great deal of influence over the quality, performance, and energy efficiency of the affordable housing projects that get built in this state. What is the best way to encourage them to do more to dramatically improve energy efficiency in this market segment?
So the first one is thinking about the QAP process for 2021 that is currently underway by Minnesota Housing Finance. It's currently open for public comments, and those close July 22nd. There's a public hearing on July 14th. So commenting and making your voice heard that you want to see incentives for energy efficiency and particularly passive house certification is a huge step. There's also some efforts in the Minnesota legislature. So we know that a special session is coming up, and we anticipate there could be work for bonding, increasing affordable housing funding, energy efficiency incentive programs. So we have a really strong renewable energy lobby in our state. That's fantastic. And when I look nationally compared to other states, we have less of a voice for energy efficiency programs, which are equally important in getting to a carbon neutral future that is equitable for the people living in these spaces too, and healthier and more comfortable for them. And then there's the advanced energy standard that has been talked about. So it's important to know that currently cities in Minneapolis can't require measures that are more efficient than state energy code, which is a few years behind where kind of best practices are in other states. So those are kind of three things to talk to your legislators about. And then finally, the biggest thing that I think would make an impact in getting these projects built to passive house standards comes from Massachusetts. So Mass Save incentivizes passive house at a few different points, not only once it's built and constructed. We really need to get funding up front to get feasibility costs and energy modeling during pre-construction, because there's a lot of these strategies, like I talked about, that are no cost and cheaper that project teams don't know about unless they have a building scientist and an energy modeler on their team right from the very beginning. So that's kind of looking at the Massachusetts model and modeling programs after that. It would be a game changer in Minnesota.
Great, thank you. Let's see, now circling back to the Q&A box here. This is a question from Chase, more around financing. Is there a sample of building budgets and project timelines for those projects discussed today so as to compare and contrast with current traditional projects?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
If I had to interpret, I think to be able to proof out that we really can come in under budget with passive house, are there demonstration projects that you can do direct compares like hook and ladder to conventional construction to be able to point to de-risk that initial investment?
Yeah, so we did some of that at hook and ladder, and I think the Northfield Affordable Homes is doing that as well. Those will be available hopefully soon.
Great. And it sounds like there's some of that work coming out of other states like Pennsylvania as well.
Yes, actually. So like looking at Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Washington, I think there's a lot of projects. At the Passive House Conference last December, a contractor spoke about how his projects are coming in below standard construction costs because he's changed his process and it's more efficient, and he's just making it work. So it's definitely a way of rethinking about building, not just adding something on to standard construction. It's thinking about how we do standard construction in a more efficient way.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, I think Pennsylvania has incorporated the passive house standard pretty robustly in their QAP process as well.
Yep, and that's where that contractor was from.
Fantastic. All right, so next question is coming from Kim. Is all the energy for the passive house building at Hook and Ladder coming from on-site solar?
No. Enough energy is coming to meet the kilowatt hours per year per person goals. The goal is under 6,200 for the passive 2015 standard, 3,800 kilowatt hours per year per person for the 2018 standard, which we used on West Side Flats. So that solar is meeting those targets, but it's not a net zero building.
Okay. And then this is a question from Jackie, but I've seen this asked in a variety of ways through the Q&A box here. And this is really around ventilation in super energy efficient buildings that are built to passive house standards. Is there a danger of any toxins in the materials just off-gassing in this construction based on the ventilation? And then how does that relate to any of the combustion emissions or lack thereof if you're building all electric as well as passive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the continuous ventilation is one of the really important strategies in passive house that improves the indoor air quality. Also, when we're thinking about any kind of virus and health issues inside the building, you're turning over the air more frequently. You're doing it in a controlled way that passes through filters. You're not sharing air between units, like leaking through the unit walls. And you're not just relying on leaky windows and gaps in your exterior wall to provide fresh air for you. So it actually is much healthier air. Another thing to note is that FIAS uses build us off other standards that include indoor air kind of safety requirements for materials. So no formaldehyde-free cabinets and low VOC paints and things like that. So it's another important consideration.
Wow, so the materials themselves are built into the FIAS standards to avoid some of that toxic off-gassing. That's great. Okay, the next question I have
and
here,
I guess I can say, and then all the appliances are electric too, so there's no combustion in the unit. Yeah.
Great. So next question for Marissa, turning back to funding again. Without substantial public funding, are projects like hook and ladder feasible?
So I'm not a developer, but I would go out on a limb here and say that I don't think that any affordable housing is feasible without public funding. So it's a matter of where we're putting our funding. And I think that investing in energy efficiency, if we're using public dollars, is a really important strategy because we're investing in the long-term, not only health of the people who are living there, but and like lower energy bills, but it will pay off in the long run and be a building that's much less costly to operate. So, I mean, we think about that study I mentioned with the 65 unit properties. Their average year construction was 1966, and they're using 2 to 3 times, three times the amount of energy to operate as the passive house building. So it's easy to get funding for kind of initial upfront costs, and it's much harder to get funding for operational costs. So when we are thinking about how we're funding housing, I think thinking about the full life cycle cost and not just the initial cost is really critical.
Great. So I'm going to turn back now to a question that was asked during registration, and this is from Martha. What is the best way to assure high performance buildings get built correctly in the field, especially in competitive bid situations? And I would add on to that, how do you make sure that the design is also inclusive of community needs and priorities?
Yeah, so I think kind of 2 parts here. I'll talk about the community need. So the Bayview project in Wisconsin that I mentioned went through a really extensive process of engaging community members, which is something that we don't typically see in affordable housing design. Usually it's developers and designers kind of leading the design. So they were able to prioritize designs that would design strategies that were most impactful for the people who are going to live there. And then I think I can't overemphasize the value of actually getting your project certified and using certified professionals, because there is a robust, rigorous building science behind all of these things that I mentioned. And that's what it's going to take to do it most efficiently and cost effectively and have buildings that actually perform the way that we hope they will perform to certify and verify them.
Awesome. So we're just about at the half hour now. And so again, wanted to thank everyone who's joined us, but also wanted to say, if you want to hang out for a couple more minutes, I know Elizabeth would be happy to answer a few more questions, and we can keep going for at least another 15 minutes or so, as long as there's interest. But thanks again for joining if you have to drop off now.
Thank you.
Let's see. So this is a question from Cameron. He said, I heard the term energy independence. What does that mean to you?
That's a great question. So when we talk about energy independence, that's a term that came more from solar. The idea that people can put solar panels on their house and be independent in terms of not having to rely on the fluctuation in energy prices, and be kind of not off the grid, but not as reliant on other sources of energy through utility companies. And when we talk about environmental justice, that has been something that's come up kind of repeatedly as well. Who can afford to put solar panels on their houses, who can afford to be energy independent, is very different from the people who need that energy independence the most. So that's why you see some programs like community solar and other things popping up, and as a desire to get this idea of energy independence to as many people as possible.
Great. All right, now this is a question from Ted, and I'm going to interpret a little bit. So I apologize, Ted, if I'm not getting this right. But today we've talked primarily about new construction, building to a FIAS standard. This is a question about rehab, though, so retrofits. For single family, is it pretty much all or nothing, or what priorities make sense for incremental retrofits? And I'm just going to assume to make them as energy efficient as possible, and even go the next step to go all electric for a cold climate air source heat pump for space heating.
Yeah, so our focus has really been on new construction, because that's where it's like a no-brainer and it's very cost effective. And there's so many new construction buildings being built right now that are not taking advantage of all the low cost energy savings potential. So we haven't done a retrofit project. I see that Tim Ian is on the call, and he has done a couple, so I recommend going to his website and looking that up. What we know from some preliminary research, and again, not based on experience, is that the strategies of air sealing are really important, and continuous ventilation with energy recovery. And then windows. We'd like to see more continuous exterior insulation be added to buildings. I think it's really hard to go to, like, heat pumps air source heat pumps have definitely increased in efficiency and their ability to operate at really low temperatures. But it's really critical that you also invest in your building envelope and not just mechanical systems. Otherwise, in times of like a polar vortex, it'll be difficult to keep your building heated.
Great. And can you mention the firm that deals with building retrofits just one more time for the audience? Yeah,
so Tim Ian has his studio.
Okay, Tim Ian, great.
Tim Ian, okay. E-I-A-N, yep.
E-I-A-N. Okay, great. Let's see, another question from Kim. Was a social cost of carbon included in any of the analyses done on the projects that you mentioned today?
No. It's definitely something that we have been talking about, but I think it also highlights that there's just a lack of funding for these studies. So there's so much research that we want to be doing, and we are just struggling to get basic building science incorporated into projects. So we really need to have cities and our state step up and pay for the science that we are capable of doing and really want to do, that we just don't have the time or resources to do.
Great. And I know Janet had to drop off, but one question here from her: how did Precipitate work with the listed architect? For instance, the Hook and Ladder project as Coss Wilson.
Yeah, so Hook and Ladder was LHB, and we worked as the consultant to LHB for that project. For the West Side Flats project, we were hired directly by the city of St. Paul to be the consultant working with Wilson, so we were a different contractual relationship. Yeah, and I think that in terms of the process was pretty similar for both. We take the existing design, we do an energy model in a software called Wi-Fi Passive that looks more at thermal bridging and continuous insulation and things like in air sealing than some other energy modeling programs do, and share the results, and then worked through kind of a exercise of figuring out what was most feasible in terms of getting to the targets for Passive House.
Okay, now I've heard this a lot. This is a question from Joe. I'm always a little skeptical about air-to-air heat pumps in our really cold days. And just to remind everyone in Minnesota, our heating standard now is, how do we heat on a polar vortex day that, is going to put us at negative 40 degrees. So the climate is a serious challenge. Are they working okay, or is the backup leaned on a lot? And I think specifically within new construction development to Passive House standards.
Yeah, so I'll speak specifically to new construction. I think that it's really dangerous to just add a heat pump to your existing building and hope it's going to work out. I would not recommend doing that. At a minimum, you need to make sure that you're doing energy modeling of the loads to make sure that your backup heat can handle it. When we did the modeling of the loads for the Northfield affordable townhomes, we estimated really conservatively that for kind of we did a good, better, and best. So for the middle case, backup heat would be used about 10% of the time. And for the Passive House compliant building, backup heat would be used about 5% of the time. And we think those are pretty high conservative estimates. But we're kind of modeling the worst case scenario. And that's going to fluctuate on the year. And is also going to change, frankly, as air source heat pumps, the temperatures at which they can operate effectively continues to drop. So rated in like -13 and -17 right now, and it's something that manufacturers are continuing to work on.
Great. And can you describe a little bit about the technology that you use for backup, just in terms of the resistance? Is that ducted resistance? I mean, we think about this as baseboard heating primarily.
Yeah, so you can certainly do baseboard heating, but there's from a design perspective, it's not the greatest. You can actually just insert electric resistance backup heat into the ductwork that is used to distribute for the air source heat pumps too. So that's kind of the most straightforward way to do it.
Got it. Okay, a question from Nicole. Are there local firms, I assume to the Twin Cities or Minnesota generally, who can do FEIS testing?
Like the verification. Yeah, yep. So that's a good point. And just to clarify, there's two pieces. One is having a certified Passive House consultant, and that's what we do. And that is helping you get through the design process. And then the Passive House verifier, those are similar, well, actually, they're HERS raters who have an additional couple-day training. The firms that I know that currently do that are Center for Energy and the Environment. If there are more, please let me know. But that's currently who's doing it in Minnesota. And they were the verifiers partnering with EcoAchievers out of Chicago for Hook and Ladder, and they are the verifiers for the West Side Flats project.
Okay. So another question from Cameron. What are your 3 biggest needs for energy efficient new housing construction that can also serve affordable housing needs?
I'm trying to think if this is a policy need or a design need. And I think for policy, I'd say it's definitely paying for early phase energy modeling. For kind of thinking about affordable housing design, air sealing and thinking about continuous insulation and eliminating thermal bridges, those are kind of your 3 most important things to do. And a lot of those things can be done without adding, they're redesigning versus adding additional things to your project. Windows are actually pretty important too. So I know like maybe a decade ago, there were a lot of studies that said like windows don't matter. If you have double pane and they're newer, it's fine. And that's true if you're looking at standard construction. If you put a triple pane window in a standard wall, it's not going to make much of a difference because your wall isn't great to begin with. If you have a really highly efficient wall with like minimizing thermal bridging and it has a nice R value to it, the triple pane windows are actually going to make a pretty big difference. And then thinking about the solar heat gain coefficient. So how much light are you letting in that provides free heat to your building? A lot of people, a lot of window folks, that window reps that you talk to will say like, oh, you want to do energy efficiency? Do like our low E coating. Well, the low E coating is designed for warmer climates and it blocks the sun's rays from entering your home. So you don't actually get a lot of that. You minimize the free heat that you're getting. So thinking really carefully about the performance specs of the windows is important.
Okay, this is a great question from Marissa. You referenced that the hook and ladder project was on a leftover site that isn't desirable, so on the railroad. How do we create energy efficient, affordable housing opportunities on desirable sites so we don't further exclude and marginalize these households to undesirable areas?
I think that's a good like kind of existential question that I don't have the answer to, but I can also say that through design we can really transform undesirable sites to desirable sites. So that's what LHB did when thinking about their site plan. There's a community playground in the center of both buildings. So they used the Passive House building as kind of a shield from the railroad track and created a nice internal courtyard that is hopefully a little less noisy than it would have been if it was just right next to the track. And also use that building as a shield to just a more limited extent to the other building that's on the site in the neighborhood.
Next question comes from Katie. What do you see as barriers besides cost to the construction of more passive/efficient housing in Minnesota? And what are your suggestions or advice here?
Mm-hmm. So I think that professional liability insurance is one of the biggest barriers. I started my firm 3 years ago, and it's been the thing that's kept me from doing what I want to do, because there's incentives built into how we run and operate things that we want to move forward with things that are proven and known and have been tested for like 30 years. And I mean, you can see even like my presentation in answer to some of these questions, like we've been involved with some things that it's not like it hasn't been done around the world in other states. Like there's no question that this technology is proven and it works, but it's not as common in the Minnesota market. And that makes, I think, architects and contractors and everybody just nervous because it's not something that they have done personally themselves before. So I think, for example, with pricing from contractors, whenever you're doing something that you haven't done before, you have to add a contingency because it's not certain and you haven't done it a million times, and you don't know what's going to come up that you might not be aware of from the beginning. And that's natural and reasonable. And so I think what we need from the building community is to not be afraid to take those risks. We know that this is better building science and results in like over the long run more easily maintained and longer lasting buildings. However, I also don't think it's fair to put that burden on kind of the firms that are pioneering this work. So making sure that we have public subsidy and like incentives to be able to encourage people to take that step and not just bear the full burden of this work on their own, I think is really important, and is an investment in the long-term health and equity in our communities.
And I'll just ask a quick question. We've talked a lot about co-benefits for passive design. Can you speak a little bit to how you see energy burden for especially affordable housing as it compares to conventional? And I think that's sort of one of the values of the upfront investment in developments like this, as you see that drop off in energy burden.
So this is a very complicated question, and I think has to do with the HUD allowances for utilities. So because HUD allowances are based on past data and averages, for hook and ladder at least, the decision was made, there wouldn't have been any way to like pay back the investment in any other way. So they ended up, the utility allowance is kind of the same in what it's set at, and then the developer is the one benefiting from the assumed decreased utilities. So I like creating that as a case study, I think will be helpful for future loan applications and things like that. But in the meantime, I think that the energy burden is just more certainty, right? So your rent is all inclusive of all utilities. You're not moving into an apartment and then in the summer and surprised with hundreds of dollars in energy bills in the winter. So I think that's really important. And I know Minneapolis has been working on some policies for that too.
Sure. Well, great. Well, we are at quarter after. This has been a really wonderful presentation and discussion. Elizabeth, we really thank you for your time and for joining us, and hope you can join us as well as everyone else here on our next call on Thursday next week for a conversation again with Janice Watts, my colleague, and St. Paul City Council member Mitra Jalali as we dig in on reliability and affordability, especially around renters' rights. So thanks so much, and we will see you next week. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the audio recording of our webinar. If you like what you heard today, you can still register and join us in person for the webinar. Just go to the website at fresh-energy.org, click on events, and find the truly affordable event listing. You can register there. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work via our blog at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. In the meantime, thanks everyone for listening and subscribing to our podcast. You can support Fresh Energy's work by making a donation today. Visit that website, fresh-energy.org, and click Donate in the upper right corner. Thanks for listening.